200 years ago, the West was America's frontier, and mining its resources was America's future. Mining, as opposed to harvesting, meant digging up, chopping down, or otherwise removing things that either could not be replaced at all, or that could not be replaced fast enough to keep up with our rate of removal. When the resources were gone, the people were gone too, leaving behind only shadows of things that were no more, empty towns, and phantom trees, or gold, or buffalo. The Sun Belt is our frontier now, and coping with 70 times as many Americans as we had 200 years ago, who all want to live the good life in a warm place, has become America's future. To build the homes and stores and roads which that future implies, we're still mining. But we're not only mining rocks or trees or animals this time, we're mining water. Over the past 2 centuries, America, and much of the rest of the world, has learned to do some things differently. We now know that even so-called renewable resources aren't renewable if too many people use too much of them too quickly. Here in Florida, though, we're still acting as if technology, or magic, will somehow make it possible for us to keep on building houses and bringing in people forever, as if our growth industry is not dependent on one of the most basic needs of all, water.
Even though every rural county I know would like to keep their quality of life, every one of them is more concerned about keeping their kids at home and making sure they have opportunities for employment, and that generally only happens with increased population. So we have a growth model that's only success is by adding people. The downside has been in 2 areas.
Wayne Daltrey was executive director of the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council for 20 years, and recently received the Florida Planning Association's highest award for lifetime achievement.
The Water Resources Act basically called for planning with understanding of a baseline. Unfortunately, a large part of that was never really completed. In fact, even now, we do not have minimum flows and levels established for many of Florida's water bodies. This is basically 26 years after the water management districts were given a statewide coverage and about 30 years after the Water Resources Act. So what happened was permits by individually could be certified as causing no harm, but collectively we've ended up with the problem. Aquifer levels continue to decline, basically statewide, where there's any large development, which is the southern and central part of the state.
Florida gets more rainfall than almost any other state, yet 2/3 of our rain evaporates almost immediately or runs off into the ocean. Life here depends on huge reservoirs of underground water known as aquifers. Our booming population already makes enormous demands on that resource. Yet the people who manage our water issue permits to almost everybody who wants one, without comprehensively defining just how much water we have or how much can be withdrawn without causing permanent damage.
The Floridan aquifer is capable of providing something like 400,000 cubic feet per second is the total flow rate. And overall, the Southwest Florida Water Management District is allowing the withdrawal of something like 700,000 cubic feet per second. And sooner or later, Mother Nature is going to force you to straighten out that balance.
Balance, or sustainability, is a matter of numbers. As overwhelming as residential development is, agriculture and industry make their own demands. And often, the needs of one group conflict with the needs of another. Nobody knows this better than Charlotte County Commissioner Adam Cummings.
Anything that affects the freshwater inflows into Charlotte Harbor is of immense consequence to our quality of life and our local economy. The proposals that they have now for continuing strip mining for phosphate in the Peace River Basin, I believe will have enormous consequences if we don't change the course that we're on. They have been mining for phosphate in the basin for over 100 years, but it continues over time to be of ever and ever greater scale. There's an element of strip mining that is inherently destructive, no matter how well-intentioned or how hard you try to do a good job of reclamation. We're taking those active steps to move us toward sustainability and a high quality of life in the future. We want the same thing from the phosphate industry.
Sustainability is hard to accomplish when Florida's population keeps growing almost twice as fast as the rest of the U.S., and when we're already overpumping our aquifers. Jim Stevenson is chair of the state's Florida Springs Task Force.
We have more blue water springs in North Florida than any other place in the world. But although some of those springs are healthy, a number are sick and even more are dying. There are a number of springs where we have been checking the discharge for several years, and we can note the reduced flow over time. For instance, Sulphur Springs in downtown Tampa. When the city of Tampa turns on their pump to supplement the city's water supply, the spring virtually stops flowing until the pump is turned off. Kissingen Spring was once a popular recreation area for perhaps 100 years, but in 1950 it stopped flowing completely and has never flowed since because of pumping in its recharge area. We have hundreds of people moving into Florida every day that think they've moved to paradise and don't really understand that it is almost paradise lost.
Declines in aquifer pressure also seem to be showing up as an increase in the number of sinkholes, which are collapses of surface rocks in places where the underground water pressure is no longer enough to support them. We can only guess at this now because the state, which started keeping track of sinkholes in 1982, dropped its monitoring program 10 years later in another apparent move to minimize environmental objections to continued growth. Instead of recognizing our natural limits and trying to live within them, wishful thinkers and politicians offer technological band-aids like desalination, which introduce new kinds of environmental problems, like more energy consumption and toxic wastes. These so-called solutions could take some of the pressure off our aquifers, but they would double or triple our water bills and provide another excuse for continued growth. When it comes to growth, our state and local governments have a poor record of taking the needs of our existing human population into account. But they have an even worse record of considering populations who have been living here much longer than people.
Manatees have been part of the ecosystem here in Florida as part of the New World for over 1 million years. Their ancestors, the Sirenia, other forms of Sirenia, have actually been around 45 million years. So they're a very ancient species that has evolved in the system, has come to use the estuarine and freshwater areas of coastal Florida. There is a program underway right now where the St. Johns River Water Management District is working on trying to establish a minimum flow. The flow rate being discussed presently would allow more than a 20% reduction in the historic flow rate before any limit would be put on that. And that would create great reductions in the amount of refuge area available for manatees in one of the few places in the state of Florida where we can actually say the manatee population is doing well.
80% of our booming population lives within 20 miles of the coast. Salt water has intruded at a rate of up to 5 inches per day into coastal aquifers, replacing forever the fresh water we've been pumping out. Now, development is paving over maximum recharge areas for our biggest and best, the Floridan aquifer. That's not only a spectacularly bad idea, but arguably a violation of our state constitution, according to a former head of Florida's original Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Natural Resources.
When you ask yourself where we came from, where we are, where we're going with our water quality problems, our water shortage problems, and other ancillary environmental problems that we have associated with basically with development and population growth in Florida, you have to go back to a history of Florida and see how we get this mentality of this culture of the development comes first and public interest comes second. When Florida came into the Union about 1849, 500,000 acres, which was known as swamp and overflowed lands, was for the specific purpose of developing the state. And so what we have then was a conflict developing constantly between what's privately owned and what's publicly owned. So this conflict has become more intense as Florida gets more population. Property owners and business people believe that the primary purpose of government is to help development. Article 2, Section 7 of the new Constitution of Florida, adopted in 1968 by the people of Florida, says it shall be the policy of the state of Florida to conserve its natural resources and scenic beauty.
Despite that mandate, aquifer levels have been dropping all over the state. In the Panhandle, water levels in some wells sank from 80 to 240 feet. Around Orlando, groundwater fell 25 feet. In Volusia County, 15 feet. That sounds as if we're overdue to start thinking differently about our water.
There's no question there's a link between water and population. In a county as populous as Miami-Dade County, with 2.5 million residents and counting every day, especially with immigration trends the way that they are, our local governments have to be responsive. They have to come up with solutions that will meet the growing demands of competing water interests. Ultimately, we want to inspire a water ethic, if you will. Just because it's cheap right now doesn't mean in 5 years from now we're not going to be having extraordinary water bills. What kind of population can this county withstand in order to have a water supply that is adequate and that the quality is suitable for drinking and for our healthy ecosystems?
Look at any body of water in Florida and you'll find conflicts of use, conflicts which often affect water quality.
We are concerned. The lake is still in relatively good condition, but what we have heard from others is that once the lake gets to a certain point, the turnaround process is so very, very difficult, and we do not want the lake to get into that kind of a condition. Straight across the lake from where presently I live, was just cleared, and they're going to be putting in a subdivision there. Subdivision was approved quite some years ago, and the lots there are smaller than what would presently be acceptable. But the officials say that because they have already been approved, that's going to be acceptable.
Lake Placid is a popular fishing lake in an area of sandy soils which have historically kept lake water quality high.
I started fishing Lake Placid in 1949, one of the most pristine lakes in the state of Florida, and I fished throughout the state of Florida. A lot of the homes on this lake pull their drinking water, house use water, from that lake. About 2 decades back, the water started turning green. We got the county lakes manager to start taking samples of the water. At the same time, hired a scientist to come in and sample the waters. Their results showed that it was attributable to the dairy on the south side of State Road 70. Their report from the DEP definitely was nowhere near the results that we have from our scientists and from the samples taken by Highlands County.
We do at times run into difficulties with the conflicts of interest between or within the various agencies that regulate water quality, water supply. But Lake Placid was suddenly inundated with very red-colored water, very stained water. We found that there was a fair amount of dairy-related stuff running off in the runoff water going into the lake. That dairy-related runoff had a fairly negative impact on the lake. What that provides is independence from some of the information that's being collected by the other agencies.
But independent agencies often have very different priorities and very different ideas about how to manage our water.
Well, I think I was born an environmentalist because I spent all of my childhood outside. That's when I began to appreciate nature. Then when I came to Florida in 1945, the whole state was a true paradise. I was just amazed at what a beautiful, gorgeous place this was. And I spent the rest of my years watching it go down the tube.
Juanita Green has spent a lot of time as an environmental reporter and a member of various environmental groups focusing on the Everglades, once the largest and still the most famous of Florida's natural areas.
When you look at the whole project that resulted in the drainage of this huge area, it appears that the whole system of government in the South Florida Water Management District is designed mainly just to keep the agricultural area functioning. When you drain a wetland, you have to have some place to put the water that you drain off of it. And that was when they began to drain water from the southern part of Lake Okeechobee into Lake Okeechobee. The Florida Wildlife Federation and some other environmental groups filed a lawsuit to stop the pumping of that dirty water into Lake Okeechobee because it was ruining the fishing. The lake was becoming just a polluted mess. The environmentalists won that lawsuit, so they began to pump the dirty water from the ag fields south into the remaining Everglades. The existence of this drained farmland in the heart of the Everglades is interrupting the entire ecology of the Everglades.
As the scale gets larger, the problems get larger too. Water from the Everglades agricultural area wound up in Florida Bay. Shortly afterward, algal blooms, similar to the red stuff we saw at the Lake Placid Dairy, turned up in the bay.
I spent quite a bit of time looking into the distribution of these algal blooms and determining what the nutrients are, the critical nutrients that are causing these blooms, and where these nutrients may be coming from. I examined various hypotheses such as sewage or nutrients coming from seagrass die-off or from the Gulf of Mexico, and I finally came to the conclusion that the blooms are the result of high phosphorus concentrations from the west meeting high concentrations of nitrogen from the east, and they basically meet in the middle of Florida Bay where the large algal blooms occur. The high phosphorus is a result of phosphorite deposits in Western Bay. These are natural phosphorus deposits that were deposited millions of years ago. Phosphorus alone, however, will not cause an algal bloom. You have to have both nitrogen and phosphorus to generate an algal bloom. Basically, you did not have algal blooms until the nitrogen-rich farm runoff was diverted to the south, eventually into Florida Bay. And you can see this on both an annual basis and on a seasonal basis. We have both a wet season and dry season here in Florida, and basically every wet season when lots more water gets pumped into the bay, you see the development of larger algal blooms. Similarly, on an annual basis, we have wet years and we have dry years. And again, the algal blooms get larger during the wet years. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which plans on pumping even more fresh water into Florida Bay, will in fact lead to even larger algal blooms. This is also of concern because ultimately this water ends up traveling south out over our coral reefs. And these coral reefs have been in decline over the past couple of decades and are already in quite poor health. And we suspect there may be an association between these algal blooms and their poor health.
In 1993, we started the Reef Relief Photo Monitoring Program. With this program, we would go out to the reef and monitor select coral formations using video and still photography. What we saw in the video transect at Sand Key Reef was pretty amazing. We actually discovered yellow band disease for the first time ever. And then we noticed white pox. We've discovered white plague type 2. There's been black band disease. There's just been a tremendous, almost epidemic proportions of coral diseases between the years of 1996 and about 1999. When you realize that corals need clean, clear, nutrient-free water in order to exist, we were faced with a dilemma with increased tourism in the Florida Keys, with increased growth developments occurring in the Florida Keys, not to mention the expansion that was taking place in South Florida. Everything that pollutes any stream or waterway in the state of Florida eventually ends up passing by the Florida Keys.
The ocean used to be the symbol and embodiment of vast elemental forces, of unconquerable nature. Incredibly, human technology and human numbers have reached a point where we are having a measurable impact on the ocean itself. And the impacts we're having on the ocean and on the rest of nature all too often come back to haunt us.
As population increases, what happens is there's a stress on the freshwater systems through use in the community, and of course there's a stress through wastewater disposal.
Joan Rose, until recently with the University of South Florida, is an expert on microbiological water quality and public health safety.
As the population has increased over the last 20 years, the way these communities have managed their wastewater is actually to use what we call on-site sewage disposal systems, commonly known as the septic tank. Generally, septic tanks are fine when you only have 1 per 11 acres. What we're seeing now is that you're seeing increases to homes of 1 per acre or even greater density, all with septic tanks. What happens is that whatever they put down their toilet ends up in the nearby waterway within 8 to 24 hours. This wastewater carries with it a number of different pathogenic microorganisms. We've been particularly interested in human viruses, these enteric viruses, because they're spread through water. The industry itself, the water utilities, the engineers, the professionals in this business know that sustainable water management is key to the future. I think one of the things that's needed is to take some of this knowledge and understanding of both the issues and some of the solutions to the community. We have to do a better job about talking about our problems and our potential solutions directly with the communities that are going to make the decision, and that includes the policymakers.
We pay a stiff price for overburdening the places we live. We pay for it in health and social issues, and we also pay for it in cold, hard cash. 20 years ago, Earl Starnes and a colleague at the University of Florida were asked by state government to study how far state services were lagging behind land development.
We looked at transportation needs, we looked at wastewater needs, and we looked at potable water needs. Those are fairly narrow limitations in terms of the study. At that time, the only identified resources through that period of nearly 20 years, through the year 2000, would have been about $18 billion. So we were probably 20 or more $billion behind when we did the study. From a sound planning standpoint, that doesn't make a lot of sense. You have not enough resources to meet even that backlog, and yet there are future needs that have not yet been determined. I think that the governments and the state government as a leader are just as simply going to have to say, look, guys, we need to stop now and reconsider everything we're doing and make a serious effort to deal effectively with our growth problems. And in some cases, limit that growth in many communities because we have exceeded by far the capacity of those communities to provide a level of human quality of life that's useful.
It is indeed all about numbers. Most importantly, numbers of people. And as with many environmental issues here, it first reached critical mass in the Florida Keys. Richard Grosso is an environmental lawyer working to connect civic planning in the Keys and other places, finally, to numbers.
The concept that we are actually running out of land to do things doesn't really register with people. But in the Keys, because the landmass is so small, it's happened already. We have run out of land. In the last 7 years, we've had unambiguous legal findings that the nearshore waters have exceeded their capacity We've now got unambiguous findings that the upland systems have exceeded their capacity. There's no more need for new science to hide behind, and it is time for politicians to really respect the law. Nowhere in Florida is the connection between the ecosystem and the needs of people so direct. I mean, so many people who live in the Keys make their livelihood off of the ecosystem there.
In the Keys, scientists have calculated what the resources are and how many people they can support, what's called a carrying capacity study.
The scientific effort of coming up with these carrying capacity conclusions about the Keys, and then marrying that to the legal effort of limiting the rate of growth and basing your development rules, your development standards on that carrying capacity study is something that is easily transferable to the rest of the state. Florida's growth management law can result in prohibiting development in some places. It can result in limiting how much growth can happen in certain places when there's a justification for it. And there are a lot of justifications for it, both economically and socially. And if people around the state really knew the truth that stringent growth management, strong environmental protection is actually good economics, it actually helps their own pocketbooks, is good for the economy of that local community, then you'd be seeing a lot more of stringent growth management, limited moratoria, and strong ecosystem protection. People would be clamoring for it.
It all comes down to numbers. As long as there is winter, people will want to come to Florida. But Florida has a blizzard of its own, a blizzard of people. Endless growth is a recipe for disaster, a phantom future that can and should fade away.
Okay, it's good to be part of a technological fix, but technological fixes haven't fixed a natural system anywhere.
We really have to make sure that the message goes home.
It's a stewardship thing. It's something where you should be aware of what's going on with the environment around you.